رحلة رقم 1 2 3.
Hi everyone, welcome to this discussion. We are very much looking forward to hearing all your well. And I think it's a little bit of an unusual conversation that we don't get to listen to so often. And through the process of, bringing this event to you, there's so much that I've learned as well. As we were having a conversation before this, I was telling everyone. As we get started, I'd first like to ask Vani to come and say a few words. She's sort of the main person who's brought all of this together as well. So Vani, off to you, and then we'll continue.
Thank you. That was Mira and me over many late night chats. Mira as an Emirati and me as an Indian who lived in the Gulf, who had conversations around this. Welcome everybody, and just to tell you, I usually never make notes. I think about what I want to speak, and then I try and wing it, right? But this subject is so vast, and also Masarat's given me a strict time limit, so I decided I'll put down some notes. I'm not covering everything. A little bit about myself. I moved to Qatar in 1999 for a lark, quite sure that in less than a year, I would return home to a job I loved. I hadn't resigned and taken a long leave from. Fast forward 17 years, 2 kids later, I was moving to a country whose passport I held, where some of my close friends and family lived. But somewhere in those 17, 18 years, home stopped being a physical space. It no longer was a location, right? But neither then nor now do I identify as a Desi. This is a conversation this group has had. It's a label that some people identify with and some don't. I don't. I don't identify myself as a Khaleeji either, which many people do, even if they are not of Arab origin. Qatar never became my home. It was merely a place where I had a house and a lot of people I loved, amongst other things I don't want to get into now. But it was home for my children. For my 2 children, it was a traumatic experience when I planned their return. I know for many people, they don't have that privilege of a planned return, right? It's sometimes just they're thrown into that thing and the parents lose their jobs, are asked to leave and the children have to leave. I had the privilege of making a planned return. It didn't make things too easy for them despite that. So this event today is a result of countless conversations with people here on this panel and with Mira, Hussein, my co-organizer, and so many other friends. Where are the spaces for South Asians who know of no other home but the Gulf? Does the third culture kid tag even fit most of them? Because it's just that home back there in South Asia and the Gulf that they know of. These are not career expatriates, right? And why did we adopt the social South Asian lens? Because they constitute the majority across the Gulf, but have a minority status in terms of power dynamics. And even though the Khaleeji culture is to a significant extent influenced by the South Asian cultures, that is not something that is worn on the sleeve with pride, right? It's always an underlying thing. These things are changing. It's not set in stone. Different communities, different groups, the conversations keep changing. So what I'm saying may not resonate with a lot of you. I'm just talking about my personal experience. So this discussion basically brings together those lifelong expats or children of lifelong expats of South Asian origin, born, raised, emotionally invested in the Gulf, whose temporariness needs no reminder. Every year or 2, their visas do get extended. The passport does go to a strange man who decides that they can continue living here. And the passport anchors them to a land where they really have no roots, few friends, and tenuous links to extended family. This discussion will explore belonging or the absence of it in some of our cases. And in terms of social inclusion, language, opportunities, residence, we have used the term Desi-Khaleeji, and thank you, Moni, for coming up with that phrase. It's a quick bait. It's a conversation starter. In the years that I've lived in Qatar and traveled around the Gulf, which I continue doing until COVID, of course, hit us on our face, one thing that I repeatedly noticed was how insular communities were. it wasn't about national identities very often. It was primarily about linguistic grouping, language, or about the villages or the states that they came from, explicitly divided amongst religious lines in many places, implicitly among caste lines. You may not hear it, but you will see it when you notice that their caste plays a role as well. South Asian children usually go to their community or national schools unless their parents can afford an international school, which then brings in this whole class, nationality-based discrimination on wages, which decides what facilities we could access. So yeah, within that school, they might meet people of different, who speak different mother tongues, who, have culturally are different, but they usually go back home where that's socializing a little bit more inward looking, right? Because there just aren't spaces. Where I lived in Qatar, until recently, there were no churches. There were some private prayer spaces, but churches came up later. There's still no place to congregate for Hindus. And these are these different experiences that bring people together in a public space. There are no neutral spaces outside of this either in the Gulf. So I've said this in the past, and Sana has reflected on it more recently, that the Gulf is not really a melting pot despite its diversity. I had the privilege, because of my job, of being exposed to a more diverse group of people. And I made a conscious and sometimes very exhausting decision to make sure that my kids met those outside of their immediate culture, even as I was grappling with what that culture was, because my household was a mixed faith, mixed culture household. There are some issues that are more complex and more pronounced. It's not just about culture, language, food, belonging. Children who grow up in the Gulf, continuing in their father's sponsorship, for instance, or on their husband's sponsorship, especially for women in very patriarchal structures. What does this mean? What kind of independence can you aspire for growing up in the Gulf? Families are not always safe spaces. We know that. And when it isn't, but your residency is tied to them, and you don't know of any other place, how do you cope? This 2-hour session is not going to cover everything. It's just a conversation starter. But it's good for us to think of all of these things as we go forward and try and create these spaces where, speaking and storytelling and sharing experiences is very healing. And it also creates a community. And I see some names here who are not South Asian. So I love that curiosity. And, some of you said that you'll never really met citizens of the country. And I know that for a fact, that many people in Qatar, many people living there for 10, 15 years, never made a Qatari friend until they went to university. So let's look at all of these things. And I'm going to hand it to, we have 6 speakers today, including Masarat, who's both the moderator and will also share her experiences. She's a Desi Emirati. Her father's journey started in Salalah, Oman, 43 years ago. And they've been in UAE for 38 years. Her family, she heads her family's foundation in Rajasthan that works on supporting girls' education. And she organizes TEDx events in the village. She now lives and works in London, doing advocacy and communications in a feminist consultancy. Over to you, Masarat.
Vani, thank you so much. I mean, there were so many, keywords, if I were to capture from what you've said, everything from, where are the spaces for us, from the whole temporariness of, the migrants' experience, to sort of being insular, connecting with only linguistic groups, religious spaces or the lack of it, sponsorships, patriarchy, and eventually finding some sort of a channel through storytelling. And so first, Vani, thank you very much. Mira, thank you so much for bringing all of this together. I will introduce the speakers as we go. And while I was thinking about this, I yesterday took a taxi, and the cabbie was this very interesting and like very, someone much older, and he really wanted to talk. And so he started sharing his stories. And, we've all had these sort of taxi conversations. And he's been in Dubai for 20 years. He then said, I plan to retire in about 2 to 3 years. And I said, why so, for example? And he says, because my son is now old enough to work. And I said, well, so is your son going to, come to Dubai to work? And he paused and reflected and said, this place is like a well. So it sort of sucks you in. And, I've given it my best years as well, but I'm leaving without anything. Like I'm leaving with the temporariness as well. And there was something very sad about that. But I think, for all, I think it's a very collective Khaliji experience that we listen to stories like that and almost sort of brush them off as, yeah, exactly. Like that's sort of the normal thing of what we all think to understand, right? But the question was, should it really be that acceptable? And as we get into this conversation, I just want to add that, it's not about nostalgia. It's not about the Lebanese and the Oman chipses that hold us all together. And it's not also about sort of demanding citizenship or eventually a conversation that goes there. I think there's obviously a space in between for us to understand the impact of holding these multiple identities, being in multiple spaces at one time. What does that mean? How does it impact us? And this idea of a temporary home, how deeply it actually affects us. And I see we have Hind Mizena as well, who's joined us. And and I'll post a link on the chat so you can listen to this later. But this is a conversation from a Desi-Khaleeji point of view, whether we choose to accept the label or not. But this is very much a conversation that, for example, Hind had with another friend of mine, Mariam Al-Dabbagh, who's got Iraqi roots and who's lived here for 30 plus years as well. And one of the things I feel that she says is, the journey starts in a good way, but the end is so abrupt. And when something is temporary, yet you cannot reconcile with the fact when it ends and how it ends. So a lot of our conversations will touch upon, very kind of similar themes. And I really hope we have some Khaliji voices also with us today. We'll listen to some of the Desi voices or non-Desi voices, and also it'll be interesting to bring in the Khaliji perspective as well. So having said that, I would now like to invite the first pair of speakers. We have Monishankar Prasad, or who we'll refer to as Moni, and he is a writer on the post-oil Gulf futures, and is studying for PhD in geography at National University of Singapore. And Moni will be joined by Sana Quadri, who is a second generation Desi-Khaleeji, born and raised in Dubai. Her parents arrived during the late 70s, and she's a writer, researcher on the Gulf and has worked with Emirates Airlines in the past. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Moni, I'm going to start with you and ask you first, what does being a Desi-Khaleeji mean to you?
Well, assalamu alaikum, evening from Singapore. It's almost night here, so yeah. So it's evening in Dubai and elsewhere. As far as I'm concerned, when I was thinking about the term, I'm a migration scholar, I'm a human geographer by training. So when I was reading through the literature, all the literature was looking at from a Western human rights lens. And it seemed that everything which happens to expats in the Gulf happens for the bad. So I was basically thinking that where are our voices? That's why this panel is so special. All of us, whichever sides that we are taking on, essentially. So when I coined the term, it was basically from a perspective of a Hindi/Urdu/Bangla speaker, where the Desh is the village. And where is my village? I speak Bangla at home. My parents live in Bombay. They retired after 30 years in Oman and grew up in Muscat. I worked all over the Gulf, all 6 of them, all 6 countries, in fact. So I'm pretty well versed with the campus from Kuwait City to Salalah. So essentially I was thinking, where are our voices? So this term is basically not to negate anybody's pathos. I know all about pathos because I wasn't paid for 8 months in one of my employment stints in Muscat, and I was food poor, and I had to almost depend upon my relatives for day-to-day sustenance until I filed a labor court case, and and I won it, and my dues were paid ultimately. So I know all about pathos. I know my parents cried for months after they retired and went back to Bombay. I know how it feels. Your home for 30 years, your car for 10 years being sold off because you have to retire and you have to head back. I know all about that. But I was essentially thinking, we are all second gen and third gen over here. So how do we reconcile our relationship with the region? And how I reconcile my relationship with the region is to accept the pathos, accept the pain, because I've seen it, I've experienced it, I've cried over it as well, experienced food poverty, filed a court case, won it, done everything under the sun. But how do I actually look at the region from a lens of gratitude as well? So when I look at it from a lens of gratitude, how can I conceptualize my sense of identity or belonging to the region? That's where the term comes from. And when I think about the term, I basically think of about a kind of South Asian belonging to the region, because South Asians were there before 1970, before the oil rush. Some of the Banias in Bardubai, in Bastakia, in Matsra, in Muscat have been over there for 200 years. And as far as Muscat is concerned, we always had a mandir to go to. We always had a church to go to. Thanks to the Banias who hold Indian passport and Omani passports later. So my experience growing up in Muscat has been very, very nice. Apart from a few hiccups here and there. So that's where my so that's where I come from, and I would like to hear about Sana's perspective. But before that, the reason why I write on these issues is because the Western human rights lens does not capture everything. There are ways to write about the Gulf, to think about the Gulf from our own perspective. And what I feel, there is a citational erasure. And whenever there is a citational erasure, there is an epistemic violence over there, which means other people write stories for us. So that's what I would end over here. Thank you.
Moni, I have a question, and then we'll move to Sana. So when you talk about gratitude and you talk about, I've gone through the pain, I've cried the tears, how difficult is it to feel gratitude when you've had a relationship that's been painful? Is it not human to feel bitter? Like, is that not a normal kind of a reaction that one would have?
Because every relationship, even with my parents, right? I'm right now 35 years of age. My relationship with my parents has not been perfect. Is my relationship with India perfect? No, it's not. So why should my relationship with Oman be perfect? So that's what my answer is.
Thank you so much for that. So what we're doing now is sort of in this first round, we get to hear point of views from all the speakers, and then we bring them all together, and then we also sort of open this to all of you for questions. I'm going to now move to Sana, who also has an interesting perspective because she's been trying very hard since her 20s to get away from Dubai. So Sana, tell us more about your experience.
Well, I have a very light-hearted take on the concept of Desi-Khaleeji, actually. I don't know what it means in spirit, and whether I encapsulate the Desi-Khaleeji identity in any way, but in the most strictest technical sense of the term, I think I do fulfill the criteria. I mean, I opened my eyes and lived all my life in a Khaleeji city that is very quintessentially Desi. I went to an all Desi school because definitely I don't come from that strata that could afford international schooling in Dubai. Yes, almost a year ago, I invested my life's worth of saving in acquiring a formal postgraduate qualification in Khaliji studies. So I don't know. I really don't know how much of it do I encapsulate. The idea of being, Desi-Khaleeji. In fact, if I have a contention, I would have with the term Desi Emirati, perhaps. I mean, long live the Federation. But Dubai is the only country that I have lived the longest in and I know well. So I would presume I'm more of a Desi Dubovi rather than a Desi Emirati.
And then tell us a little bit more about your experience growing up, and
Yeah.
then changes a little bit of what you view as identity.
Right. So, I mean, there's this saying by the great Egyptian novelist Najib Mahfouz, who said that um, home is a place where all your attempts to escape stop. So, well, I have spent a good chunk of my 20s trying to escape the country, either east or either west, wherever I might get accepted. But as luck would have it, it didn't materialize. I mean, part of the motivation was that I just didn't want to perpetuate this, helplessness, onto my unborn children. Uh, but then, yeah, I mean, in the past half a decade, I can say that, I mean, if I wanted to leave earlier, it was more so because of this reason, my own identity, my own future, my own dignity. But then in the past half a decade, it's been more guided by the fact that, if I want to feel invested in the prosperity of this country, then I cannot, alienate myself with the local politics, with the significant 10% that make up the citizens of this country. I mean, with this whole, announcements of, longer term visas and passport. I no longer configure myself in these announcements. I can't but help think about the individuals who were born with this passport, but had it taken away from them, or for the mothers who cannot pass on that citizens to their children. So now my status is that if I can't really bring about a change, then I better get out of the way. So that's pretty much the state that I find myself in. So previously I was just wanting to escape for my own future and things like that, but then now I think if I can't really bring about any meaningful change in the sense that, I mean, my dignity is also connected with the significant 10% that make up this country, and yeah, so better just make way, because I feel my existence, is pretty much a hindrance to the real emancipation to happen. I hope that made sense. I'm sorry. Yeah.
What would you describe as change, the change that you seek? If you feel that you've given up on this idea that citizenship will ever come, so what is this change that you seek?
Change as in every respect. I mean, this is a very, the country is almost 50 years old, and this has been, this question has been, about identity, about who really belongs, and it's still in the process of sort of being worked upon. And then, I feel that, of course, we are the dominant. We are the majority here, the silent majority, the expats, but we need to have this conversation about, we can't just completely shut ourselves out from the experiences, the displacement, and the dispossession that is also suffered by the 10% that make up this country. And especially if we are Indians, we have to be mindful of the minorities. If we go on and on about minority rights back home in India. So why is this perception, a very dominant perception, that the minorities are like the privileged minority? No doubt they are a privileged minority, but then I think the way expats have completely, shielded themselves and are immune to the real stories, of the 10% that make up this country and the problems that they face. So I think, I can't help. I'm sorry, I can't help. I'm a student of politics and humanities for almost 2 decades of my life now, so I can't sort of stop myself from veering into that aspect. I'm not just doing it for the sake of doing it, but yeah, this is what really guides me now. That just get out of the way if you really can't do anything. Because I think, this is the burden that expats should have on themselves, that, your presence in this country is pretty much a stumbling block for the real emancipation to happen here.
So I find this interesting because I'm going to come back to sort of this almost a cynicism with Moni's optimism. But my question to you before that is, tell me a little bit more about this idea of an emotional citizenship.
Emotional citizenship. I mean, I will always identify Dubai as the place where my parents live, and this is what really differentiates between our experience as third culture kids in the Gulf with third culture kids in the West. Because everyone leaves their house at the age of 18, they go for further studies and things like that, but they always have a home to come back to. For us, that is not the case. We don't know whether our parents will be still here, and that trauma is real. So I mean, we might not have those stories that third culture kids in the West have, that of suffering bullying at schools and not being facing racism and all of that. We might have, but we might not have to that extent. But this is a real trauma, I mean.
And I'm also, it's also, I think the concept, when you stop and think of how acceptable this is, forget that others find it acceptable, the fact that you accept it. And for me, a lot of this actually started a personal realization only when I moved out. And, 10 years ago, I moved to London after getting married. And when you just start, it's not just a tourist visit, and you have to start investing yourself living in these countries. So now I feel like this is such it's almost like two very different worldviews, and you have to reconcile both, and it's such a struggle. But I have to say that one thing I feel liberated from is this sense of uncertainty, which we've normalized growing up, talking to all our friends and everything, that everybody would also tend to agree with it. But now I look back and I think, I don't think that we should just agree to that. So I'm going to come back. We've got a comment here from Naz, who says, I hear you, Sana. I've spent my 20s trying to escape as well, but here I am, having decided to finally bid goodbye. And it is very hard. It feels that despite the lows and the bad and everything else, this has been home where I grew up. And when time has come to finally bid goodbye, it is actually very, very difficult. I'm going to bring Moni, Sana, both of you in now. So one, Moni, do you have anything that you want to immediately react to in what Sana has said?
Yeah, I completely understand, because I went through this experience a couple of years back when my parents moved back to Bombay. So I've seen it with my eyes. I felt it in my bones. It is very, very difficult. Honestly, my parents still look back at that Facebook photos which they uploaded while they were in Muscat, and then they chat about it, looking in a very nostalgic way and everything, and leave alone the Oman chips and the shawarma and stuff like that, because Oman chips and the laban and stuff like that. Whenever I was working in Dubai before Singapore, so I used to carry for them, in fact, practically a bag full of Oman chips for them. So even if we leave the Gulf, we don't really leave it. And as far as emotional citizenship is concerned, the emotional citizenship was basically a take on Professor Neha Voda's consumer citizenship in her book, which calls that middle class families in Dubai and how they express loyalty, belonging, and how they actually live the space in the Gulf, which was published about a decade back. So emotional citizenship is basically a notion in which we are of the region, but we are not of the region. But for me, Muscat is home. Muscat will always be home. So nobody can take that away from me. No passport, no visa status can take that away from me. So that's what it is. Thanks.
Sana, do you want to come in with especially sort of the optimism, cynicism point to what Moni was making about, that yes, not all relationships are perfect. They don't have to be perfect, but how much imperfection should we actually tolerate?
Again, I mean, it's to the larger question that I'm not here to be countering narratives. I still don't feel like, I mean, this is what I feel. And I don't have to present a picture to anybody. I'm just speaking about my state as of now. And cynicism, yes, I know. I mean, like I said, I can't help being cynical and, to feel what I feel about certain things. But I guess there is, if you look at it, I have what I shared has quite a positive connotations to it. I mean, I want to be working towards, I feel very helpless. I want to be working towards bringing a change, but then I have my own limitations. And yeah, the only difference is that it's just not keeping me in mind. So as much as I'm trying to personalize my story, I am also trying to reiterate that much of what I feel cynical about and want to change is nothing to do with me.
About you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a question from Faraz who says that, I've often asked friends from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and how do you reconcile with the racism that you face? And, since both of you have lived here, over decades, what do you actually feel? Do you feel that it has grown with time? Do you think it has gotten better over the years? What is your sense? Moni, I'll come to you first.
Excellent question. Thank you for bringing this up. It's a huge elephant in the room. Yeah. I would like to answer it in such a way that, well, the sense of othering is there. Of course, there are implicit signals of being racist are always there in the system. But while we are growing up, when we are young, our parents tell us that not to put our head towards that direction. These things happen, and we internalize the racism, and such things happen. But when I started, I did college in Muscat, by the way. So I did my engineering in Muscat. I worked there after my engineering before graduate school. So what I realized is that once a Kharji, always a Kharji, right? So that always will be there. So whether if you can't agree with the racism, I believe there are exit routes everywhere. But if you want to stay back, yeah, it's a part of the deal, I guess. But whoever brought it up, many thanks. We need to talk about such issues as well.
Thank you, Faraz. Do you want to go, Sana? What is your perspective on the racism?
Yes, to Sri Rag's question. Yes, I'm quite sure. I mean, the whole world. I mean, all of us know about the draconian systems of Kapala and all of that. And but then again, that's what I mean. As a second generation, I don't even want to call myself an expat or an immigrant. I didn't migrate here. So I guess all of these, ailments that are at the heart of Khaleeji existence are pretty much also rooted in the fact that, it's just not. Yes, I mean, it's very simple to say there's just one privileged minority versus a disenfranchised majority. Yes, of course, that's the case. But then again, I mean, looking forward, a lot of these ailments, perhaps we can sort of do away when we sort of, for once, fix this, foundation. The idea of how, going forward, how the society is this balance really sustainable? 90 is, I mean, this complete skewed figures of 90% expats versus 10%, and everything that comes with it. So you can't completely negate these finer points and questions what are pretty much what forms the structure of the societies here. Yeah, you can't ignore that.
Yes, Moni.
Well, a very tiny tangent to what Sana said. Well, I grew up in Oman. Oman is not spectacularly rich as Emirates or Kuwait. So as far as having Omani peers in school, Omani peers at workplace, we always worked with Omanis of various socioeconomic strata. right from a person who is working in a shopping mall to a person who is at the ministerial level at the Wizarat, because my father was a civil servant, so I saw expats at the ministry, I saw local Omanis at the ministry. So what I can say is that as Oman is a multi-ethnic society with Swahili speakers, with Baluchi speakers, with with even Urdu speakers, mixed race, Omani passport holders, even Hindu Banyas who hold Omani passport. It is a very, very diverse country. So as far as racism is concerned, at best it is very, very subtle and implicit, and it is structural in nature. So that's what my point was. Thanks.
I'm going to just take a comment, a question, and then we move to our next speaker. So Mohammed Khan says, well said, Moni. Most expats aren't even aware if labor laws work in their favor. So glad that you won the case. And on the second point of the Western lens doesn't capture the lives of expats, I could not agree any less. The Gulf has a terrific marketing engine that helps push this utopian narrative of the ideal place to be. And a comment and question for Sana is, I'm very curious. I hear words like emancipation and minority versus majority, and it feels very confusing. So can you elaborate on how closing off by the expat majority could lead to becoming a stumbling block to the 10%? Sure, the numbers are askew, but how are we being the stumbling block, and what emancipation are they seeking for, and how are we affecting that? So haven't we been part of building the country? So in terms of power, sponsorship, kafala, so on, how are they being affected by us?
I think I already addressed it earlier. Just, I think I nothing more to add actually. Like I said, I mean, there are definitely conversations going on with regards to, and a lot has improved in terms of kafala, I would presume. And but then again, somehow the dominant perception of the minority being the privileged, lot here needs to be also sort of countered, and their stories needs to be heard as well. At least I feel as a second-gen immigrant. And there is no, denying of the fact that, the 90%, the existence of a 90% expat population is, in some ways, perhaps I'm not talking about the, definitely the vulnerable section of the expat population as being, directly responsible or should feel guilty, and I don't want the entire, expat exodus from here, so that finally everyone, all the 7 Emirates, all the Khalijis, all the Emiratis across the 7 Emirates feel finally emancipated and things like that. But then it's just that, when I think of my place in this country, I cannot negate it, and I just cannot completely be sucked into the whole, labor-related values and all of those issues. The only thing that I can talk on is pretty much, emancipation of the people who are officially the citizens here.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to our next speaker. We have Irene Pramod, and she is a final year student at Georgetown University in Qatar, and she's also an incoming PhD student at University of Michigan. She's a second generation Malayali in the Gulf and works on migrant media practices as well as religious lives of South Indian Christians in Kerala and in Gulf. Irene, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a conversation between both of us. And let's start off first with, what do you think about being a Desi-Khaleeji?
Well, I think like Vani, I would need to agree that the term really doesn't mean very much to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, the term Desi, it is a somewhat homogenizing one when you think about South Asia as a whole. And it kind of ignores the nuances between, for instance, North India and South India, and the ways in which North Indians and South Indians deal with each other, but also deal with people within their own ethno-linguistic communities. And so I can't really recollect a time where I've either called myself Desi or engaged in things that might typically be. It's just not a term that I think I relate with very much. And the second thing is, the second component of this term, Khaleeji. the thing is, I grew up in the Gulf, first in Dubai for a large majority of my life, around 18 years before then coming to Qatar. And I can't recollect very much my interactions with the local population, whether it's the local Emiratis or the Qataris. My interactions with them have been very few in number, and they haven't added very much to my own stay in the Gulf. And if anything, my parents have engaged with them as kafils or in some official capacity, but it's not been very much more than that. And so I guess the term itself does not resonate very much with me. And even the term migrant, I suppose, doesn't resonate very much, because I remember asking my mom once when I was doing my research, I was asking her about migration to the Gulf, and she said, "What is this migration? Only birds migrate. We didn't migrate over here. We are just people who came here to work, and we happened to come to Dubai." It wasn't, her husband saw an ad in the newspaper in the 80s and they decided to come to Dubai, but it was not their dream destination. It just was an opportunity that opened up in the Gulf. And so whether or not they would have landed in Saudi or in Doha or in Qatar or in the UAE, it was somewhat of a coincidence as a whole. And so the whole Khaleeji aspect of it is a bit tricky to address, I suppose.
So do you think semantics could be a problem in if we don't know how to describe, sort of who we are or what this experience is? Is there a complexity that comes with it in how do we really talk about ourselves?
Absolutely. And the tricky part of all of this is that how do we identify ourselves? Because even when I look at this panel, it is really quite impossible to put one term, one defining term to encapsulate all of our experiences. Because to be honest, the destination in the Gulf, which Gulf state you're in, there are major nuances, major differences. And if you're in Dubai as opposed to Doha, if you're in Riyadh as opposed to Salalah, there are major differences in terms of how exposed we are to the local culture, how inclusive the environment is. It differs dramatically. And so it's very difficult to even come up with a term to define our experiences and to define who we are. And I just find, I guess, it's a sort of in-between identity, an in-between space between South Asia, wherever in South Asia, and wherever in the Gulf. And so it's a constant sort of needing to move back and forth between your home society and expectations and whatever you encounter in the Gulf. So it's nothing fixed exactly is what I'm trying to say.
So this brings me to this idea of translocality, this notion that you exist in two places or more at the same time. And, having been a Desi-Khaleeji, and I'm going to use it loosely with all of you tending to agree or disagree on it, but tending to be a Desi-Khaleeji, you are constantly split between, the homeland and also with what we also call home. Like, I mean, when I tweet now, when I move from London to Dubai or to India, I say home 1, 2, and 3. And it's just very difficult, right? So tell me a little bit more about this feeling, because I think, for some of the other people who maybe haven't had a similar experience, or I'm sure with others who can relate to it, this feeling of being split in like two places at the same time, what does that actually feel like?
It is a somewhat disorienting, and also, I guess it stems from an initial dislocation in the whichever Gulf state you find yourself in. And I grew up sort of observing my parents, because obviously I'm in the Gulf because they came to the Gulf. I don't really know if I would come here by choice. And now that I do have the option with higher studies and whatnot to move away, I feel myself kind of wanting to move away for a number of reasons that I'll try to address. But in terms of what this translocality or what this being in two places really feels like, it kind of feels like not fitting in anywhere. It's not fitting. I personally don't feel like I fit in my within my family or with my wider community back home in Kerala, because my time in the Gulf has done a number of things. First of all, my fluency in my native language, Malayalam, has taken a major hit. And the reason is because I was in a regular CBSE Indian school for the first 5 years of my life in Dubai before I was homeschooled. And during those 5 years, I realized, 5 to 6 years, I realized that the majority of the students who are North Indians really looked down upon the way South Indians spoke, the way Malayalam was kind of spoken. They really had a certain, they just didn't seem to like it very much. And over time, in those crucial formative years of my life, I began to resent my home language, Malayalam. And it's only within the past 5 years when I realized I want to study Malayali Christians in the Gulf, that I had to start learning the language literally from scratch, learning to read and write and to pronounce certain words correctly. And even when I would go back every couple of months to Kerala, as many people do, I realized that they find me to be a very strange person in the family, because my parents continue to find ways to straddle their home and host societies and expectations. But for me, as a second generation migrant / expat or South Indian, it was a bit more difficult. So I kind of remained an outsider both in Kerala and in Dubai. Because, and another thing that I realized is that in many ways, my parents sort of faced a lot of pressure to socially reproduce what was happening in their home society. They felt the pressure to often reproduce that in Dubai, especially with me as their daughter, their only daughter. So in some ways, I often felt like a project of theirs, a project of social reproduction that they were constantly anxious about maintaining control over. And they often struggled to figure out, like, if I was doing something strange, out of the ordinary, that their family members back home were not doing, it caused them a great deal of anxiety, a great deal of stress. And so this whole thing about whether or not the Gulf is really an extension of South India, or is it a separate space altogether? So it's a very strange in-between sort of set of struggles that my parents have had to deal with, and indirectly, I have also sort of needed to face the consequences.
I think, Irene, you've just articulated the nuance of it very, very beautifully, because for a lot of people, and I think for the lack of a polished word, but they perhaps deserve it, but for a lot of ignorant people who make comments like, just go back home, do not understand the complexity of what home means to us. And it's, where do you completely go when you don't feel that the whole of you is accepted, whether in one country or the other, for example. I want to also then hear you talk a little bit more about, this viewing things from the lens of opportunity as opposed to precarity. So this, for me, at least when I think of it, links a little bit to what Moni was saying, that, let's look at this from the lens of gratitude as opposed to something else. So is this similar? Explain to me a little bit more about what you mean that we look at opportunity as opposed to precarity.
Right. I had brought this up during our last discussion over here, well, first I need to preface this by saying that I come from a privileged background. I come from a dominant caste Syrian Christian family. And so it's middle class. And so when my parents came to the Gulf, their kind of precarity that they experienced is very different from the kinds of precarity that we would talk about when we think of the working class populations. It's very different. Yes, my father did come, when he came to Dubai, he came as a very low-paid engineer on a 2,000 dirham salary. And then he experiences upward trajectory in terms of his employment prospects and other things. But what I realized growing up is that during moments of precarity for my family in this middle class context is the precarity of, or the possibility of losing your job, of not being able to worship in public because, or worship in, or congregate in public spaces as a Christian, not as an Anglican or a Roman Catholic, but as a Pentecostal Christian, which is what they eventually converted to. But I guess my parents were able to find ways to become leaders in their communities overseas amidst their precarity, because when the threat of deportation and imprisonment was put in front of them, they were able to mobilize that precarity by becoming leaders and by gaining credibility within their own communities in Dubai, and so become long-term sort of religious entrepreneurs, or become long-term sort of these pioneers in certain kinds of worship and certain kinds of practice. And without that precarity element, especially with regards to the threat of deportation and other things, they would not otherwise have become prominent members of a religious community. And so that's what I mean by opportunity amidst precarity, where people, these Indians in the Gulf, they find ways to mobilize their precarious situations and find ways to do things that they otherwise might not be able to do, or do things to gain credibility, to build a support network overseas, which I guess also helps to ground their own experiences. And so, what I mean by opportunity amidst precarity is not just, like Moni said, not just to focus on exploitation, labor rights, and all of that, but to also look at how migrants in their own right exercise everyday forms of agency in what they do in order to find ways to craft their own life worlds in ways that often go under the radar, things that you often might not see at first glance. But if you ask questions and you probe a bit more, you see that they are not just victims of the labor systems they find themselves in.
I think, there's resilience, but there's also this thing that resilience is very pretty on the outside, but is, just a very sad and almost a wretched thing from within. I'm going to take a comment from Batul. She says, Kuwait based and raised Indian here. I've also noticed a disjuncture between those of us who've spent our adult early lives, experienced the region, and how my friends who never returned after high school, how they experience it. So unlike many of my peers, I ended up going to university in Kuwait. And in some ways, I found that it has complicated my relationship with the country which is not the relationship with the country in ways which is not true for my friends who continue to live in India or elsewhere. So I'm just curious to know if, these subtleties, is this something you've seen? Do you?
Sorry, Masarat, could you please repeat that last part again? I didn't
Sure.
quite get it.
So she says, I found that, this has complicated my relationship with the country in ways which is not true for my friends who continue to live in India or elsewhere. So is this do you see these subtleties in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess where you grow up and where you sort of hail from in terms of your home society, and because even within this panel, you see people who are from a Sunni background, a Shia background, or generally a Muslim background of various sectarian differences, and then you see people who are from a Hindu background, of a Christian background, and these nuances, in addition to whichever South Asian country you come from, these two things sort of really do complicate and nuance our everyday lived experiences, because it's not easy to always reproduce or transplant our home environment in the host environment, because the political and the legal framework of whichever Gulf state we find ourselves in, it adds this level of complexity. Because, for instance, if you are like me, if you come from this sort of Christian background that did not originally have a church in the UAE or in Qatar, you'll find yourself needing to kind of innovate and to find and create a community for yourself, which otherwise might not have existed. And so these nuances in religious, sectarian, ethno-linguistic, class, caste backgrounds. All of these things need to be taken into account when describing our lived experiences here, which is why it's not really possible to even use this term Indian. It really doesn't say very much. If you say the Indian diaspora in the Gulf, what does that even mean? There is no single thing. And also, are you talking about middle class Indians? Are you talking about dominant caste Indians? So there are many sort of nuances here that go well beyond any single framework.
Thank you for that. And I'm also conscious of time. So I would now like to move to our last set of panelists. Thank you so much, Irene. And I want to now introduce Zainab Mirza. She is a writer and community organizer curating inclusive spaces and discussions. She co-founded the Divan, which is a cultural initiative and a discussion platform, and also founded Typelings, which is a writing community. And she will be joined by Nazreen Nazeer, and she is a second-generation Indian from Kuwait who has been trying to reconcile her idealistic dreams with a very pragmatic reality. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining. And Zainab, I'll start with you first. What does being a Desi-Khaleeji mean to you?
Hi, Masarat. Thank you. Well, when I think about it more, I've never really felt any affinity to either term, like Desi or Khaleeji, but I like and appreciate the attempt of creating a label that takes into account our identity and acknowledges it, rather than each identity being viewed as separate. So it's more of an amalgamation of these identities and these selves within us, rather than treating them as alien to each other.
Nazreen, do you want to go next? What does being a Desi-Khaleeji mean to you?
Sure, can you hear me well? I had to take my headphones off. Okay, so I, as Vani and Irene have said, so I am also Malayali, and my parents, but they grew up in Chennai, so basically we're from the south, and so for me, the term itself linguistically did not used to really come naturally to me, but I started relating to it a lot more when I've seen online a lot of South Asians, especially from the West, second-gen, third-gen citizens in the US and Canada who refer to themselves and try to create a sense of community with others from South Asia. But I do think that it is something that linguistically I would not have thought of as naturally. But so how I try to describe myself, which I found was necessary when I moved out, and I used to be asked, okay, so I used to be looked at as from Kuwait. So this is why I wrote in my bio as well, I'm Indian from Kuwait, which is right now I'm at that stage. This is what I tell myself. But Desi itself, yes, it's something that I see as a more Hindi or Urdu kind of term, but I like when it brings us all together and we're able to sort of put some umbrella term to have a beginning sense of community.
I like how all of us have such a sort of different way of looking at it. And I know I've not given my view of Desi-Khaleeji and what it means, but I really liked Moni framing it from that point of view. But just for me personally, I think I just never thought about, like, for me, they're almost like tags. And I never thought of myself as a Khaleeji at any point. And it's a bit of a strange, I agree that I don't mind using it, but then also I feel like in terms of labels, it doesn't always define you completely. So I want to start off with you, Zainab. Tell me a little bit more about your experience, because so this conversation with Zainab and with Nazreen is really a personal journey, and both of them, they also know each other, and there's a way the story intersects. So we'll start with Zainab, and tell us a little bit more about, and then how do you went on to sort of create the spaces that you did?
Sure. So growing up in Kuwait, I went to an Indian convent school. And I had a majority of Indian friends, but we also lived in neighborhoods that were inhabited by mostly Arab and Iranian residents. And so this enabled us to forge friendships with our neighbors who were mostly from Lebanon or Palestine and Egypt or Iran. My dad also worked several contracts which enabled us to meet and befriend a few American families. So this added to the richness of my experience interacting with people from different cultures in Kuwait. But despite that, by the time I had finished school, I still hadn't made any Kuwaiti friends or had even met a Kuwaiti my age, because there were no spaces where residents and citizens could meet and interact. And if there were, we didn't know about them. Our awareness of local culture was limited to the Kuwaiti TV series that used to air on KTV2. There was one called Duruba Shak that used to air in the early 2000s. I see you guys smiling, so maybe you're familiar with it. But it was our family tradition to park ourselves in front of the TV at 10 p.m. every night and just watch the show. So it was really strange to me that we shared a country with over 1 million Kuwaitis, but didn't share space with any of them. So to us, they were the other. And I'm sure it made me think how do they see us? How do they otherize us as we do to them? Fast forward to when I came back from India after completing my university education. The first Kuwaiti, when I entered the workforce, the first Kuwaiti I had a proper face-to-face conversation with as an adult was when I was interviewing for my first job. And around me, there were residents who were creating more cultural spaces where they could be themselves, but there were still barriers to integration. And through work, I met with a Kuwaiti whom I befriended, and his name is Hamid al-Barechi, and he later approached me with the idea of starting a book club. And this idea sort of grew into a cultural and inclusive space with events for people with varied interests. So from a book club to movie nights to music jams, where we could offer a space. So it became like a melting point of ideas where individuals from diverse communities and cultures, residents and citizens alike, would attend regularly and feel safe enough to share their ideas, their experiences of society living here, philosophy, literature. It was amazing, and also to be able to showcase their talent. Last year, so it's been about 5 years since we created this initiative. It's called the Divan, and for our 5th anniversary, we posted a collection of photos from our past discussions on our Instagram account. And the kinds of responses that we received were so heartwarming because there were people who had moved out of Kuwait, mostly residents, naturally, and they had shared their memories of coming to our events and how it felt like a home away from home for them. And that it was like a family, like the Divan felt like a family to them. So I realized over time that if I wanted to take space and feel belonging, I had to create it. And that's really how all of this came about.
Thank you, Zainab. Nazreen, do you want to pick up from there as well and tell me your side of it?
Sure. So just to begin from where Zainab has left off. So I met her when I was seeking out these kinds of event and community spaces, and I really applaud and I love that we have people like her who do make an attempt at creating these spaces. But I have a different perspective to that as well, where where Indians or a lot of South Asians, we tend to do have our own insular communities where based on similar linguistic commonalities. And I think it came out of necessity as well, because when the neighborhoods here, and I'm not sure if it's in other countries, were planned, they were segregated on racial and also occupational identities, and even in terms of class. So for example, you'd have Kuwaiti mantaqas, right? And then you'd have expat neighborhoods where mostly expat families lived, and then you'd also have bachelor neighborhoods. And then somehow I think people try to socialize with their own communities. For example, there's so many Kerala associations, district-wise associations, Kerala Sunni, and then within Sunnis, different sects. So I think it was a way of sort of trying to do what we can outside of what we can within our own capabilities, and to break that sense of isolation. Because if we cannot really integrate with the existing locals, like, why don't we make friends with those who are coming and then have our own events and things like that? And also, I think sometimes, because especially those of us who grew up here, who were born into this place, we don't, or at least me personally, I didn't grow up conscious of that temporariness. Like, you know, I was just living as myself. This was home. This was, and what I thought of as goals were more like career-wise, and I had goals which were not related to my identity at all. So I think only as you grow older and come out into the space, you sort of start thinking about belonging in different communities. And then sometimes doing something in that end to fix that becomes a full-time job. And then I'm like, okay, we have these other goals as well. Do I leave them? And then, you know, try to also do something for the society at large. But I think we need different kinds of people doing different kinds of things to make living here and everywhere a lot more inclusive and better. Do you want me to go into my personal journey as well, backwards, and come to how I did meet Zainab?
Go ahead with it. And I also, you know, if you had a question for Zainab as well, I think that would be great if you want to bring this here about sort of almost the privilege of, you know, creating options. If there's something around that you also want to address.
Yes, exactly what I said, you know, these 2 points in terms of how sometimes it does become a full-time job, that the choice that you do get to make change in this way. So maybe your perspective on how that's been and how you've seen it differently from your own social circles, maybe the way that your friends look at it, their sense of belonging in this country, whereas how you do because of your journey in with the Divan.
Sure. So when I returned from India, like, I found so many things that were happening, but I never like realized I had the choice to also do the same, because there were residents who were creating, like, there were a lot of different cultural events that were happening that didn't happen when we were growing up in Kuwait, right? For me, it really came about with a program that I attended. It was a youth advocacy program that was led by, that was organized by an organization here called ND. And like, it put so many things into perspective, because one of the things I learned from that program was a concept called active citizenship, which is where you are an active community member and contribute to the community that you belong to. And through that, I realized that what is really stopping me from, you know, creating the change that I want to see. Of course, there's so much we all want to see change, but it has to start somewhere. And what I was hearing a lot were complaints from people who hadn't done anything or weren't even having positive conversations.
So now, before I come to you, I'm just going to, so what we'll do now is we'll open the floor to questions, because there are a lot of questions that overlap everything that all of you have said. So that's maybe the best way to do this. And we had a little bit of tech issue with Vani during her introduction. So Vani, I'd like to just bring you in, if you can repeat a little bit about the family being hostile bit, if you just want to come in and sort of say that once again.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to all of you speak, the assumption is that we'll always have this family, right? That we'll go back to, however excluded we feel. But also to be conscious that families are not always safe spaces. So what happens to children whose visas and residencies linked to that family, to the father or to the husband? How do you cope with it? What are the systems in place? So when we're talking about conversations, when you're talking about belonging, it's not so much your right to live there, but as long as you live there, your right to have a safe environment. And is that being extended to you? So just something for us to think about. We don't necessarily have to discuss it or get into it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think it's just going to come up in the other themes as well. So we'll take this. Jay says, absolutely agree with you, Nazreen. Growing up, never took Kuwait as a temporary home or anything. It was and it is home. It's only after a certain age does the temporariness hit you. So my question to you, and I'll start with, well, whoever wants to take a stab at it first, is when does this idea of this temporary home, like when does the temporariness actually become a thing for us? Like at what age does it? I have this really vivid memory of being 7 years old and like just twirling and just sort of in my own world, and the TV behind me was blaring about the Gulf War, and my parents having this very panicked conversation, and me just kind of being in this zone of like just doing my thing, and like there's something happening, parents are worried, but it's okay. And now it just, the question makes me think, when do we really start thinking, is this something we inherit from our parents? When does it become a thing? So who wants to go first? Sana, do you want?
Okay, fine. Yeah, I'll go ahead. No, I mean, talking of the Gulf War, actually, I remember. I mean, this thing. I mean, I was, I think, hardly 5 years of age. Yeah, but then my father had actually. I mean, we were told that there will be a lot of, power shortages and things like that. So I remember my father sort of buying candles in bulk, and and then our relatives back home in India trying to impress upon him that please, I think it's time you better come back. It's because I mean that's what the aura was like, because Saddam Hussein actually threatened that he's not going to be stopping at Kuwait, he would be going beyond. And so yeah, I mean, again, I think for me, in the sense, when I sort of became responsible for myself, when I became full-time employed, that's when I, sort of, I mean, I think somewhere back in your head, you do realize that, this is, I mean, you are an outsider, but I think it doesn't strike you that you have to leave, perhaps.
Yeah.
You are really, you are, it's because especially, I mean, it's internalized that, okay, we don't fully belong here, but then I think the phase where you sort of really start working towards deciding for yourself and end this limbo kind of an existence, I think just pretty much comes when you are pretty much on your own feet.
Okay.
I'm working here.
Irene, do you want to go next? You're on mute, or there's no sound.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just to add on to what Sana was saying and also about what you were saying, I find that living in the Gulf, with your family at least, it kind of insulates you from wider family safety or security networks, perhaps back home, because even, especially in my experience alone, just being with my nuclear family, my parents and a few relatives here and there, you really have to choose what parts of your life you open up to your extended family back home. And so if there is domestic abuse in the family, for instance, you really cannot really go to say anything about it to anyone. There is a great deal of insulation that comes with living, at least in a family unit in the Gulf, as well as a sort of reordering of norms about what is acceptable to speak back home. Because if you're going for your biannual or annual holidays for a couple of weeks at a time in your home country, what do you really want to say? There is a sort of pick and choose. And even when you call back home, do you really want to expose everything? And it's not like you are in this sort of extended family network all the time. You kind of have to choose which parts of your life you open up as a family and as an individual in the family. And so in that sense, there is an insulation that I think comes with living in the Gulf. And with that insulation comes a removal of any safety or security sort of wider familial networks. And there is an alienation as well that comes with that. And so you kind of, as much community as whatnot you can have when it comes to actually finding security in a source, in a family source, I think it's a bit more difficult to come by. at least when living away from your extended family in the Gulf. But I don't know what the others have to say about this, but it's just something that, because even if it comes to reporting something like this to the authorities, it is a bit tricky because I really don't know how that exactly works. Like if there is any kind of domestic abuse, anything else, it's a bit tricky to handle, especially when you're a child or when you're a dependent of your father who is the primary breadwinner in the family.
So we'll come to the legality aspect second. I'm taking a comment here from Dalal who says, I am a Kuwaiti with maternal roots in India, Kerala. Growing up, most of my close friends and school friends were all expats. I didn't know the term expat or what the term meant back then. It's only after many years when my friends started relocating after high school, I understood about the temporariness. And I just want to bring Nazreen here because, you've left the country as well for a couple of years, and you were in India, you were in Paris. Tell us a little bit more about your experience and what you sort of learned during that journey.
Sure, absolutely. And just to tie in with this sense of temporariness, like I would say that I personally felt that only in the recent past, especially with a lot of COVID-induced laws, and I happened to come into a situation where my visa at work was at risk and my status was uncertain, which is when I really felt that. Whereas when I was a kid, my dad used to always try to force in or drill in the fact that we were only here, for work or for making a better life out of ourselves, and this is not where we eventually or permanently were. But then, as I said in my bio, I never thought of that as important. I always focused on career and what I could do with my own life. And this thing about passports was only, I thought it was something that people with kids worried about how their kids would go to school and get healthcare and things like that. So I grew up in an Indian majority neighborhood in Salmiya. I went to Indian school, and my issues at that school time were just about how nerdy I was and how I tried to fit in with friends. And even in my own circles, for example, we used to go, because we're Sunni Muslim, and then we used to have a lot of Kerala associations. So we had that community, and I would feel left out of that community because I didn't relate to a lot of the values. And even my family as well, we have cousins here. So in a sense, I should have felt very comfortable and at home. But because a lot of the values, even though they were my blood, I didn't relate to that. That was my struggle then. So I think in a way that also helped me sort of socialize out of my community because I didn't really fit in there. And then when I went to Chennai for undergrad and sort of came out of my shell because, you get the street smarts when you go to India. That's what they say. You grow up sheltered here, and you get book smart, and then you go to India, you get street smart. And that got me out of my shell. And I think when I came back, I went to PwC, and it was a multinational workforce. I had my first Kuwaiti friends. So I did meet a few Kuwaitis before that because I used to go to these religious gatherings where there were a lot of nationalities. And I also forgot to mention that I studied Malayalam as a kid because I think my dad always tried to keep us in touch with our roots in terms of religion, in terms of language. So we went to these cultural associations and I learned there, and I loved languages. So, but when I was at PwC, so that's where I met a lot of other expats as well, Arab expats. But I was still in that networking zone. I wasn't really socializing with people outside of work. And then when I moved to Paris a few years later, 2015 is where I was in the restaurant field there, and I saw that the sense of belonging there and integration was completely different. Like there were people who were socializing with each other across like class lines, like working class, if you would say. Like here you would not see a banker like sort of hang out all the time. Like this is my personal experience with a waiter, but there I would see people hanging around across gender, across nationalities. And then when I came back, I had a different layer of perspective as well. And then I came back with sort of a timeline of my time here because I had also faced a couple of other kind of racist experiences in my first time as an adult in Kuwait, which sort of strengthened my sense of wanting to leave, but trying to get ahead in my career in finance. But then that's where I sought out events like Zainab's, and then I also saw circles that are coming up, which were in Kuwait over the past 5 to 6 years, which are trying to get a lot of younger people across different nationalities. I'd say it's opening up, especially with Gen Z and younger millennials. And then another aspect that plays in is when I was seen as coming from Paris, I felt a little differently. I also had more of this confidence. I was not seen as coming as an Indian expat who grew up here. And also I've been told that I look Kuwaiti. So that also makes people like sometimes just come up to me and speak in Arabic. I think that, like these visible identities sort of open up, make you more approachable. I guess this is how a brain categorizes. So that way I've also made like a different set of friends. Like I've got Kuwaitis who are actually my close friends and who I socialize with outside of work settings and things like that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Zainab, do you have a comment to make?
I just wanted to add on Nazreen's point about other communities also cropping up. On a more personal level, I found that these conversations and these friendships that have formed as a result of creating and being a part of these communities has also given me, maybe Nazreen, you can relate to this too, a more nuanced understanding of the politics, the systems, the culture, traditions, the mindset of the country. Before, if you don't have that understanding, you tend to see it as a very black and white thing. And because of this more enhanced context, I now have a greater appreciation and empathy when analyzing social and other issues that come up. So I just want to add that it's really important that we create these spaces and have these where conversations and relationships can thrive, just so that we can address issues like racism and discrimination and create an understanding not just between citizens and residents, but also within pockets of diverse communities within the resident population.
I completely agree. I think, having the voice or just giving voice to our own experiences is a very incredibly important starting point for us to envision anything else going forward. I'm now going to, so I see that our sort of official time for the webinar is up, but we'll extend by about half an hour because we've got getting a lot of questions. And there are some attendees who also want to make a comment. So Akash, are you there? We can unmute you if you would like to make your comment. Batul, Hiten, Insia, if any of you guys want to make a comment, please let us know and we will unmute you. Batul, yes, I can see you. Please go ahead.
Hello, hi everyone. I really loved listening to this conversation today. It's refreshing to have a space for this conversation because, as I think we all know, we usually have these with just our friends or sometimes our family members. And I think so. Yeah, I just wanted to jump back on what something Zainab mentioned. I think Nazreen as well. In terms of these conversations often leave me with a sense of despair because no one really addresses the so what. And so it's personally I myself am a development professional. I work with the civic space for Kuwait, and the one thing that I'm learning increasingly that if we want, as a community, as people who with these diverse experiences of living this sort of temporary limbo life in the Gulf, if we want to do something about it, we've got to be the ones sharing these experiences. There is, when you talk about some of the issues that Vani raised about on questions of abuse in family spaces, of gender rights issues and such, on all those things, it's a question of us creating the space and sharing our narrative, because what we now see again, and I think this is something that Moni spoke about at the very beginning of this conversation, is everything's written from a human rights lens. Everything is spoken about as, oh, the poor expats are oppressed and all their rights are violated, which, yes, there is a rights problem. But again, it is a far more complex and nuanced problem. And the only people who can shed light on that complexity are people like us in this webinar who are listening to this conversation and who have these experiences. We're not going to get the validation of these experiences from the citizens, I will say that, even from well-meaning citizens, because they don't have these experiences, right? So it's a conversation that we need to be willing to have the courage to have, even if it makes people uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much. I think that's also a very important point. It's also not about how do you make it important to them or relevant to them. I'll move now to Akash, who also wants to make a comment.
Hi, thanks very much, everyone. I think the perspective that I wanted to share that I was reflecting on as everybody was speaking was that of my dad. And so my dad moved to Qatar, in the 70s as a young man in his early 20s. And so he had to be there he worked there for about 40 years before he went to India. And I try to stop describing his reintegration back to India as a move back to India, because when he left and when he went back to India, it was as foreign to him as it was to anybody else, especially after 40 odd years. And I try to reflect on all the experiences he must have had and the belonging and the identity crises that he goes through. And so as I reflect on the conversation that I've had with him, and there's always a sense of nostalgia associated with all the experiences you've had spending decades in a country that you spent contributing to its development. And I think that's sort of the main reflection that I have, right? Like, after all your years of productive time spent working, what do you have to show for it when you go back to India, where you've never spent your most productive years? So we talk about the development of the Gulf region and all the countries in its wealth and its HDI and its progressiveness as an identity of a state. But then where does that come from, right? It comes from the 90% who actually contribute to the development of the state. But then once that productive time is done and they go to where they're perceived to be coming from, that's no longer there. So you don't have any fruits of that labor to show. You don't have any of that contributory evidence to show what you've done with your time, except the stories and nostalgia that you can share with everybody else in India or wherever you're from. But that feeling of loss is more paramount than just your sense of identity, just your sense of belonging to a wider community, but also what is it that you've done for these 40 years and there's nothing to show for it except something more tangible in where you may have been able to build a home or educate your kids or talk about the successes of your kids like my parents do with me and my brother, because that's the testament of what they've been able to do with these 40 years of living in the Gulf.
Akash, thank you so much. Yeah, that's a very poignant comment, and I'll let Moni come in.
Hi, Akash. Many thanks for your point. I loved it. My father was a civil servant with the Ministry of Manpower. He was an economist. He worked with the Ministry of Manpower in Muscat in Oman for about 25 years before he retired. And I always had this conversation with my dad because he had left his job in Bombay, where he taught at a very prestigious college. He taught economics at a very prestigious college, and then he had come to Muscat. Of course, he had come to Muscat following my mom, who taught in the Ministry of Education in Salalah in Oman. So it's my mother who arrived here in Muscat first. So as far as these conversations are concerned regarding tangible impact, regarding material impact of the families, these are certainly points which are very, very valid. But how I would like to address it from my own experiences, my father said that I taught or I helped educate to 25 years, right? So almost 3 generations of Omani graduates. And my father taught marketing and entrepreneurship. And initially he taught economics. So that's what he said, that he retired at 63, 64. So he said that I'm now 63, 64. What I have to show for my contribution to this country. And my father always used to ponder over it. So his impact was told to me from a very unknown source. I was working at a consulting firm in Muscat in Oman, and I had and I was supervising an intern, an Omani intern, a UK educated engineer, and her fiance was actually my father's last batch from the Ministry of Manpower College in Al Khair in Muscat. So when she heard that my father taught at the Ministry of Manpower and at this college in Al Khair in Muscat, she said that, what is your father's name? I told them my father's name is Dr. Prasad. So she went back and asked her fiance, saying that, hey, do you know this professor, this teacher, this ustaza, this ustad, do you know? So the next day she came back to me and said that, I asked my fiance regarding your dad, and he said that he's a very strict marker in examinations. And he does not let marks very easily in the paper. So can you please ask your dad to be a little less strict? So so the thing is that as far as impact intangibly is concerned, when you're educating people or when you're helping grow an economy from the scratch, maybe in the oil and gas sector, maybe in manufacturing, healthcare. So these things happen, and we cannot do accounting over here. It's not a balance sheet. So such kind of experiences enrich our understanding of the region. And many thanks, Akash. Maybe I took a bit too much time. Apologies for that.
That's okay. Thanks, Moni. We will go to Mohammed Khan, then I'll go to Gayatri for your comments next.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for this wonderful platform. It's my first time actually to listen to so many different views about Desi-Khaleeji. Myself, I came to Qatar in 80 when my dad had come back much earlier. He was working for the army. So I did my schooling here in the Indian school, and then I had the chance to join the army. And over the last 40 years, I have been working for the Qatari government for 30 odd years, during which time I have picked up Arabic, formal education, and then I have a lot of local friends. And for the last, let's say, 6 to 8 years, with the advent of social media, I have been a very passive listener, because I get to see both points of view from the locals as well as the expats. And in order not to drag this further, what I feel, what we lack as Indians, number one is when Indians are coming to the Gulf, they are not properly guided like the Westerners are. If you are coming from the West, you would have so many references, you would have so many books to read on how to live your life over here and how to make the best of it. But we as Indians, we are still, I can assure you that there are people landing today who have no idea of what to expect from a life in the Gulf. Overall, there would be hearsays, there would be stories about how to, look out for yourself in terms of the labor laws or accommodation or whatever. And I have lived also in Dubai, so I know that there is no comparison of life of an expat or an Indian in Dubai to that of Qatar. Because in Qatar, until recently, we were really secluded. It wasn't like how it is in Dubai. In Dubai, you need to look for a local to actually see a local. But here it's only locals, and you need to look for an Indian from your place. I have a lot to say. I'm not going to take much of your time. Thank you for the opportunity. And I would like to see how this platform is going to go ahead, and does it become a movement? Does it become It's interesting. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I mean, over the course of actually planning this, I think there's so many interesting perspectives from other Gulf countries that, I also got to learn from, and I'm sure, a lot of us have a similar experience. Thank you so much for sharing your point of view. We will now go to Gayatri, who also wants to make a comment.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Thank you. This was a very interesting conversation to have, and I think a lot of different perspectives came up, which was quite nice. And so I grew up in Saudi and then moved to UAE after a while, and then I moved out to my for uni, and that's to UK, and that's when I realized how different our experiences were as Indians growing up in the Gulf and as third culture kids there versus third culture kids in the West. And there was this particular culture class that I took at uni where we had to say which culture we identified with a lot more, that is from from which country we came from. And that is when I really thought about the whole identity thing, because a lot of Indian origin students in class who grew up in the West kept saying, oh, I identify more with the Western culture or wherever that particular country that they lived in all that while. Whereas I didn't really think I identified well with either India or with the places that I grew up in. So that was where I started thinking about this a lot more. And adding on to, I think somebody a bit earlier, Akash mentioned something about his father going back after 40 years and having to readjust and how foreign it felt. And I pretty much think it was the same with my father as well. He spent more, I think about almost the same time, almost 35 years there, and he had to move back to India, and he kept, and constantly, ever since he moved back to India, he had this feeling that, oh, this is not how things were supposed to work. Why is this like this? Why is this country like this? Because he moved out of India when he was barely 20, and coming back after 35 years, he spent a majority of his life outside, and India felt foreign for him. And that was something he took a lot to heart. And he kept, this was a sort of sentiment I observed with a lot of people my parents' age who kept saying, people go to the Gulf to work, but not to make a life for their family, but not to make a life for themselves, which sort of impacted me a bit. And a lot of them had this feeling that, you either come home, either if you're retired, you come, I don't know if you could use home, because, you come back to India or to wherever your country that you started out with, your country of birth, either if you're retired or, if you lose your job or, you're sick. So it's not mostly because of choice, but they're forced to. And this is when you compare it with, people who moved to the West or to places that offer citizenship, where they basically, even if these things happen over the course of time, they still have the kind of the way that, I don't know, that they could stay there longer, and that is not a cause for them to move back. And the only reason they would move back is out of choice. So this was something that I wanted to put across. And also, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but so pretty much the last point. I think there was a lot of difference between countries in the Gulf. So I grew up in Saudi and in UAE, and the experiences in Saudi versus the ones in UAE were very different. In Saudi, we were all, my parents are Hindu, and we weren't allowed to, even to, I don't know, how do you put it, to express our religion, I don't know, to sort of or something of that sort. You're not supposed to say that you're anything other than Muslim, or you're not supposed, even if you are, you're not supposed to show it in public. So you can't you can't have identifiable markers of a different religion in Saudi. Whereas in when we moved to UAE, that was a lot different, because you are allowed to. There are temples, there are churches, and people do go there, and you could, practice your religion in public, which was there. So there are differences in a lot of experiences that come by because of it. And yeah, so that was something that came up. I'm sorry I took up a lot of time. So thank you a lot for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Gayatri. I think one of the nuances which is really interesting when you look at, people talking about Khaleeji identity, but actually the experience in these different countries can be quite varied. I want to, come to Irene for a question, but before that, touching upon this idea of parents, Zainab, I wonder, if you and Sana maybe want to take a stab at this first. You've stayed in these places for a really long time. Do we look at our parents almost sometimes with bitterness? Do we look back at this uncertainty that we feel maybe in teenage years now, and as we grow up, our perceptions change. But do you feel a sense of bitterness sometimes of why do I feel this uncertainty for such a long time? And is this something that comes from them?
Zainab, go ahead, please.
Okay. I've actually felt anxiety for the past couple of years because my parents are getting older. And like I personally, this has worked for other people, but it doesn't work for me. Like the idea of immigrating to Canada, like most Indians do, just doesn't make sense to me personally, because I don't know anyone in Canada. One, I don't have any family there, and it's too cold for my family anyway. And it doesn't make sense for me to move like almost 2 continents away from my family and loved ones. So the anxiety stems from, where do we go? When like it's an eventuality. It's like I've never been under the delusion that, things will stay here forever or anything like that. So I don't feel any bitterness. I do feel maybe a bit of annoyance that we don't have a plan B in motion, but my mom is of the belief that things always work out, and they will continue to work out, inshallah. So, yeah.
I mean, this the point of anxiety is also interesting. We have, Shahida, who says, she speaks about never heard of Desi-Khaleejis as an identity before this forum. So, Shahida, there's always a first time. And I don't think I identify as such. And I've heard Desi as a term during my MBA in USA, but I don't identify either. And so there's this anxiety because I don't know where I belong. So I think this anxiety is actually a very integral experience, to what we feel. Sana, do you want to come in now as well? And then we go to Irene for the next comment.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do have a lot of annoyance with my parents. I'm over the worst phase actually, with regards to, they have not really prepared us in the sense of sort of creating avenues where we could really, we have loads of relatives, by the way, in the Western Hemisphere. So sort of creating, avenues where we could easily relocate and move out. So, and the fact that, being a South Asian female, I think I can really understand their perspective of not having, of going the safer route, of not really, sending their children far off and things like that. So, I for one am very glad that I'm still not a parent, and there's very less likelihood that I will become parent in the coming years. So yes, I am. So I'm ending this kind of this vicious cycle. So it ends with me. So there is no third generation coming. Although I have 4 nieces, who are part of the third generation in my family. But thankfully, I have the peace of mind that there's no more coming. I mean, I'm not going to be perpetuating this vicious cycle, at least on my part.
Okay, I'm going to pick that up. I'll go next to Irene, who wants to take up Deepak's comment.
Yeah. Should I read out the comment or should I just respond to?
Sure. Do you want to briefly say what is written?
Yeah, I guess in sum, Deepak's question is about how researchers studying non-English communities in the Gulf, how the researcher kind of shares his or her research with these people and how you kind of interact with them. So this relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee and how all of that works. And in my case, it has been a very interesting one for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the age difference, because most of my interlocutors are at least 15 years older to me, 15 to 20 years older to me. So when they interact with me, they very often say things like, oh, please feel free, like come visit us in our apartment like you're a family, you feel you're like our daughter. There are things like this that are commonly said because of this age difference, because they know I'm in Qatar without family. And so they interact with me there is a nice sort of affective sort of dynamic that goes on. But also because I'm interested in researching certain intimate aspects of their life, including their religious lives and the struggles they've had with creating church communities, I sometimes do wonder what they actually think about my research and why are they exactly helping me. And it's often in a sort of South Indian Christian sort of culture, we often end our interviews with a prayer of sorts, which usually the head of the household, the man, often leads. And in this prayer, what I often hear are things like, in this thing that she is writing, in the thing this Irene that is writing, let it be a testimony of how God has protected us and kept us in the Gulf, and let this be a testimony for the future generations after us, for them to see how we have lived our lives in the Gulf and how we have sort of been here for so long and been loyal to God for all these years, and how we made it through all these struggles and how we have landed where we are today. And so it is in these last ending prayers that these people pray that I often am able to understand why they are so interested in providing detailed first-hand accounts of their experiences and their struggles, because there's something with the written word in writing an article or writing a thesis or whatever, that they are invested in this. They are invested in the final outcome, whether published or not, but they're very invested in what is eventually written about them, not for the wider academic general audience, but for their future generations to read and to appreciate about their lives, and for it to kind of serve as a testimony, a written testimony of sorts of their lives in the Gulf. And so I just find that is a very interesting sort of question that I wanted to address.
Thanks so much, Irene. We have a comment from Hussein Abbas. Do you want to, would you like to join us to ask a question? Hi, Hussein.
Hi, I just wanted to sort of pick up on the point about bitterness, I guess, that we were just discussing. So my perspective, just to give you a little bit of background. So I'm originally from Karachi, but in 2004, my parents moved to Bahrain, and so I've been living here for about 17 years. Bahrain's a bit unique because there is quite a significant local population. I think there's like a roughly 60-40 split. So it is the majority, but you still have a lot of expatriates. I think the bitterness definitely comes in certain aspects of where now, having graduated and back here in Bahrain, working now, where you feel like a sort of like a temporary permanence in some sense, of where you're not really sure why exactly we came here, because there's this sense, I guess, as you're growing up as a Desi, that you feel that affinity or that experience of growing up, let's say in Pakistan or India, where you have people of your ethnicity and your culture surrounding you. I feel that's lost, and so as you grow up, you start feeling that bitterness in that sense. I don't know if that's something that other people have felt, particularly.
Is there anyone on the panelist who wants to address this? Moni, go ahead.
Well, excellent point. over here. As far as the bitterness is concerned, the bitterness I feel is a part of a journey, right? Of growing up in the Gulf. There's early bitterness, moderate bitterness, and there is peak bitterness, and then the bitterness curves falls when we figure out other things. So as far as alienation is concerned, I would like to talk about myself. I never grew up in an Indian building. I went to an Indian school, but I had a Filipino neighbor, a Sudanese neighbor, and I believe another Arabic speaking neighbor while growing up, Egyptian neighbor, sorry, while growing up. So I never really spoke Hindi, and my Bangla is really bad. My Bangla only improved lately, in fact. So I learned Arabic. I understood from where people come from, but one way to process the bitterness is that do you want to belong to the region, or do you want to create another alternative to your life? That's where the tension comes from. The bitterness is actually stemming from a constant tension between the structural transience, a sense of belonging, and our aspirations. So at which stage of the curve we are at, the bitterness falls over there. Sorry for the analytical metaphors. I'm an engineer by training, so that's how it is.
Thanks, Vani. I'm gonna just for the sake of time, speed up. And Hind has given a question, and I'm going to put that to Nazreen, and then I have a final question for all of you, and then we wrap up. So to paraphrase Hind, what if we don't belong? Is it such a bad thing, Nazreen?
So I wanted to say that, yes, for a lot of people, I think, especially for me, I can relate that I do find power and strength from not belonging, or I think it's also something that a lot of people with a more trying to be in a more individualistic sense can relate to. But ultimately, when things like I mentioned in my journey, like when things come to hit the fan, when it does come to the pragmatic realities of like, okay, are you going to have to suddenly leave without any plans or future income? Then that sense of abstract feelings of belonging, not belonging, and just being able to do what you want kind of takes a hit, and then you have to sort of reconcile with the realities as well and try to plan out in a more pragmatic sense. And also another thing that I wanted to say is, yes, for me that has been my way of living and thinking. For me, it has always been about just personal growth and experiencing new experiences. And I think if you don't feel belonging or maybe rootedness in the conventional sense, then you are able to grow more in that way. But I also think even from that aspect, I have outgrown at least where I live, because due to a lot of reasons that I cannot go into at this point, I do feel like the place does not really give you maybe the spaces or the ability. At one point, it's like, okay, it's like you've outgrown a certain space, So I think, yes, it is an amazing feeling to feel until realities hit, and then you have to do something about it. But also, even in that sense, I don't think a lot of the societies or the communities that we live in are giving us the opportunity to experience that individual sense of freedom and non-belonging and have different experiences.
Thank you so much for that. We've got a comment saying that, parents came here for a better future, so I don't feel that sense of bitterness. So I'm going to give all of you a minute to basically, from the conversations we've heard, and thank you all for joining. This is, it's been a really great conversation. It's also, we were thinking as we do this, is this going to then lead to more threads and more different kinds of conversations coming forward as well? So, being children of immigrants, it's very complex. You've got just so many point of views. You've got the gratitude and the opportunity and the Arabic language integration, which we couldn't touch upon so much, but reconciliation. And when you have so many overlapping themes and, the trauma and all of that, what about the next generation? So we know Sana kind of, cuts the cord here. But if I start with Zainab, what about the next generation. Are your children, for example, do you plan all of you to raise them in the Gulf? What is their experience going to be like? How do you how do you feel about it? I'll give you all about a minute to end with your final thoughts.
I'm not married and I don't have children, but I would hope to, I would want to live in another country just to, grow and enrich, have more enriching experiences. But if fate were to decide that I would continue living in Kuwait or the Gulf, I would want to empower my children with the concept of active citizenship and being active members of their community, and tell them, or empower them with the idea that they can create space. They don't have to struggle with the idea of belonging. That struggle doesn't have to define them, but they can create the space if they want to take space.
I think that's a really great way to end the empowerment and being more proactive about what we can do, sort of to create this narrative for our own lives. Irene, do you want to go next?
Sure. So with regards to the next generation, I don't exactly think either. I don't think I'll be staying in the Gulf for very long. And I also think that the whole idea of parenthood has somewhat been it's been a bit marred by what I've sort of seen and experienced growing up in the Gulf, because I now have come to associate parenthood with projects of social reproduction. And I am not really able to dissociate one from the other. And so I definitely do not think that even if I was to have a family, I don't think that that would be happening in the Gulf, simply because of this strange in-between space that the Gulf sort of is in relation to India and South Asia more broadly. And it is a bit tricky. I understand it is tricky for parents, but also tricky for children to navigate that.
Absolutely. Sana, do you want to go next? We've partially, we know where you're kind of...
I know. What else do I say? Actually, yes. I mean, 2020 would have been my final year in the Gulf or in Dubai, actually, but thanks to pandemic and some other personal emergency. So I'm pretty much here around. But then, yes, pretty much echoing Zainab's point, if I were to have children, which is unlikely, I would want them to be active citizens, but then I would make sure that it doesn't take place here. So I'm still not comfortable with the idea of having I might have a long-term future for myself here, but no, not as a family. I don't want to. And in fact, also look forward to that. If I have to leave the country, I would definitely, I think it would allow me the freedom to work off the changes that I want to bring in. So I think I would have more freedom from outside to work towards. So I think, the bonds remain in some way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Moni, go on.
The answer would be an affirmative. Yeah. The answer would be an affirmative because I live in Singapore.
Sorry, that's the shortest answer you've basically given us throughout the webinar.
The answer would be unqualified affirmative. Yeah.
Oh, you can elaborate by, I'll give you.
Okay. Take 60 seconds more. Okay. Why? Because it's a multicultural environment. You can see the world through other people, which is a possibility in the Gulf. If you can manage things properly, then it is a pretty safe childhood. It is a pretty safe childhood, and safety is something we take for granted in the Gulf, but it's a pretty safe place. So I would like to end at that. And many thanks for the opportunity, guys. Wonderful to talk to everybody.
Thank you so much to all the panelists. It's been wonderful having this conversation with all of you. And like I said before, I think it could have been an hour each with all of you. I'm going to bring Vani in and please with any final words.
just thank you so much for joining. It's been 2 hours and counting, and we've barely scratched the surface. Mira has put something in the chat box. We are hoping to continue this conversation on Clubhouse over several sessions. So look out for our Twitter accounts and make an announcement. And I hope this has been helpful to all of you to just speak out. And thank you so much, Moni, Nazreen, Irene, Zainab, Sana, and Masarat, for just trusting what Mira and I wanted to do. Thank you so much. And Mira, thanks a lot. Yeah.